So in the previous discussion, we established that what the middle way is. So the question we should be asking ourselves now is, does that mean that whoever takes on the Buddhist teaching, let's say, converts to it from whatever other view they were following, does that mean by just being convinced that the Buddha is right and trying to do what he says one should do, one is already practicing the middle way?
No.
Why is that?
Because the middle way depends on having the Noble Right view. It is essentially the Noble Eightfold Path, and this is something one needs to acquire. It is something one needs to see directly for oneself. And that is frequently overlooked nowadays. So we cannot say that everyone who genuinely consider themselves to be practicing Buddhism are therefore automatically practicing the middle way. There is a further discernment is necessary for that.
So what happens if a person thinks that I know what suffering is, I know what craving is, I know what the cessation of craving is, and this practice that I'm doing, whatever it might be, is my way to fortify that understanding that I already have. Because some people might not take themselves to be, noble ones, but they feel that they are kind of, they have kind of this middle ground where they can still access the middle way, whether it be the Noble Eightfold Path or any other practice, even if they don't specifically think of it that way, which the Buddha said would lead to the cessation of suffering. So, what is it that, how is it that a person can know, regardless of how much they might have improved their views over a period of time, that they still don't have the middle way?
Well, from the point of view of ordinary person, the noble disciple has basically completely freed himself or herself from suffering. That's got to be the basic view there. So we're not talking about sitting down regularly on your meditation cushion and feeling a bit more calm and peaceful on account of that. Therefore, suffering is diminishing. Therefore, I conclude that I am practicing the middle way, or that I have somewhere along the lines acquired the Noble Eightfold Path. It is more fundamental than that. So one wants to be honest with oneself and recognize that you run a great risk by casually assuming that you are already practicing the middle way, whereas if you put the bar as high as possible, you can still continue doing what you're doing, but you do not run the risk of falling into the basic conceit that you think you've got something which in fact you do not.
Yeah. So basically one way would be to say that if the bar can be set higher, it should.
Yes.
There is nothing to gain, even in if you're going by a wager, there's nothing to gain from setting the bar lower when you know that it could be set higher. So if your practice of the middle way leads you to be free from suffering only sometimes, or in certain situations, dependent on performing certain things, then you know that the bar could be set higher by saying, well, suffering should never arise in the first place. Not that I should be having a perfect way for it to kind of deal with it once it's already there, because the one thing that should be noted as well is that the Noble Eightfold Path is not only you walk this path so as to be free from suffering. It is while you're walking this path, to the extent that you're walking it, you are free from suffering. So if you, like, basically an arahant is the one who perfectly walks the Noble Eightfold Path all the time. Because it's not like a destination. It's just being on that path means being free from suffering to the extent you have understood it. So it's not like a momentary thing where I do these 8 steps, then I get freedom from suffering, then I repeat it again, then I repeat it again. If that's the case, then that's just management. But apart from that, let's say, like you said, the person is doing some kind of practice and they get a little bit more peace out of it. What if they get a lot of peace? What if it generally feels like, everything that they read in the suttas, everything that they kind of make sense to them as what the Buddha taught? What if that practice that you're doing generally seems to be leading to that direction? Like they don't experience any suffering. They feel like they know the way out. And there doesn't seem to be any issues. So what else can a person have as a criteria to see whether that is adequate or not? Like internally, not
Well, one thing they could consider is, like, if they are practicing methods, techniques, things like this, they could ask themselves, what if I stop doing this? If the peace that they think they have disappears, then they should conclude that that peace was a very conditional one, that it depended on them basically managing their suffering, and that is not at all the peace that is the very foundation of the Noble Eightfold Path.
So it's basically the extent to which you don't have, because the middle way should not be understood just as we said in the last talk, just as a choice between two extreme, like it's not even two extremes, it's two sides, so to speak. So it's not like if I just can avoid the extremes, I am walking the middle way. And those two sides are obviously it's called self-mortification, but in another sutta, the Buddha talks about these two sides as being indulgence and those who regard observances as the core. So instead of referring to it as self-mortification. So if their practice depends on a certain observance, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be like a very coarse rites and rituals, which is how sīlabbata-parāmāsa is often conceived of. It just means if your practice depends on any sort of action, even if it's a mental action of kind of going through these mental drills of be it breathing techniques or even contemplations, if it is dependent on that, like if you can't stop doing it for 2 years or more and still know without a doubt that the same amount of freedom is there that you had from the beginning, then you are regarding observances as the core. Like your freedom is dependent on those observances. Even if it seems like they are diminishing your suffering, the fact that it depends on an observance should already be seen as an amount of suffering that hasn't been overcome. Because as the Buddha said, being dependent on things is what suffering is. Not like whether suffering has arisen right now. So that is a form of, and like it's not accidental that it's synonymous with self-mortification, because that's another thing. Self-mortification doesn't have to be on the level of mortifying the body. It doesn't have to be on the level of making yourself experience physical sensations. Like it's just the attitude of denial, whereby even thoughts that have arisen, things that have arisen on their own, as the Buddha said, these like the 5 aggregates have to be understood like it's a pile of leaves that somebody leaves out there in the forest, and Like, you obviously know that this is not yours. So if somebody's taking it away or doing whatever they want with it, you should not be affected by it. So practices that revolve around manipulating your present experience, like, I have this certain feeling or this certain thinking, and I need to get rid of it. Well, for a Puthujjana, the identification with the five aggregates is always necessarily there. So they are essentially mortifying themselves, because they are, like, the only reason why they feel a need to get rid of these feelings or get rid of these thoughts is because they are identified with them.
Yes.
So it is self-mortification in a very acute manner.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what piece comes out of it. The fact is, if it was dependent on this kind of, like, control over the five aggregates, means, like, basically, yeah, you have to abolish, from the point of view of a Puthujjana, you basically have to get rid of yourself in order to reach that peace. Whereas the true middle way is about abandoning the five aggregates as they are.
So there should be, you are making a distinction between getting rid of sense of self and abandoning aggregates.
Yeah. So, or you don't have to regard it as abandoning sense of self. Just getting rid of sense of self. It's just, as the Buddha said, upadana or assumption is not the same as the five aggregates.
No.
But there is no. It's not that it's the same. It's not that it's different. Rather, it is the desire and lust in regard to the five aggregates that is the upadana there.
Yes.
So, for as long as a person hasn't understood what that upadana is, what that assumption is, they only have two options. They either indulge the aggregates, like they try to make more of the pleasure that they're already experiencing, they try to kind of increase and proliferate further, or they try to change the aggregates, get rid of them, alter them so as to make them different, because the current state is too unpleasant, so I have to get rid of it.
And both of these responses are precisely the desire and lust, which is the upadana.
It is still both of them are still the desire and lust. So that's why self-mortification in this ultimate sense is not different at all from indulgence. It's all of it is just rooted in this attempted, or this sense of entitlement towards having the aggregates different than the way they are. So now, what is it that, I mean, because again, a person will not be able to recognize what the assumption is right away. So they can't use that criteria, because they will be telling themselves, no, I'm not trying to get rid of the aggregates. They're going to be sure of that.
Or they might say, I'm just from now on going to accept everything the way it arises.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which will then include all their wrong views and habitual attitudes, which are part of the problem.
Exactly.
So to practice a sort of, let's say, radical acceptance or
open awareness
or things like that might on the surface look like it is very close to the middle way, but actually it could be very far away.
And it could be like you would be accepting the aggregates again without noticing, because that's the thing, you don't have the criteria. So you don't have the criteria to see what is that desire and lust. So there is infinite room for you to be still engaging with it and seemingly doing something different.
Yes.
Because all you see is kind of the obvious stuff. So
how then does somebody go about it?
Not just that. Before we get into that, how does a criteria that a person, even without having discerned this acute assumption, how would they know that they are still dependent on manipulating the aggregates? Apart from thinking in terms of whether suffering can arise or not, because many people are sure that their technique, or they might not even regard it as a technique, but what they're internally doing as a form of management, they're very sure that it's going to work every time. So they're like, what would be another way for them to know that there is still assumption? Because assumption as well there are different types of assumption. Assumption of views, assumption of virtue and duty, assumption of sensuality, and assumption of self.
Yes.
So how would they know indirectly, so to say, not based on their own criteria because they can't trust it, but based on something else, that there is still an assumption?
Yeah, so how is someone who is still affected by upadana, who is still assuming sense of self, let's say, as the most fundamental upadana, how is someone not going to deceive
or
themselves?
Or not even that. It could be...
You're including the four basic
any
upadana,
of
basically.
them, yeah.
Okay, so these four kinds of assumptions you just mentioned, how is someone going to be honest with themselves as to whether they are still assuming those assumptions?
Yeah, without relying on whether their practice seems to do the trick or not.
Uh-huh. Well, assumption and direct knowledge don't go together.
Mm-hmm.
One is only assuming because one doesn't know and see for oneself. But then the difficulty still emerges again because one might be convincing oneself that it is otherwise.
Yeah.
So there is a sort of, it seems to me you're asking about a basic kind of self-deception that is going on.
Yeah, but there would be ways for you to kind of, I mean, it would require honesty.
Yes.
But things that would have to be there anyway, like even if, as long as there is assumption, doesn't matter how much your practice seems to work, these attitudes would still have to be there. These attitudes regarding your practice would still have to be there.
You would be passionate about your practice, basically.
Yeah. So how would
it will be dear to you.
How would you measure that?
Well, if you can stop it, and if you have an issue stopping it, then that's
that's what he said as well.
That's what we said. Now it occurs to me, like for example, if someone questions your views and your practices, and you feel the need to defend that what you're doing is right, you know that you're still operating on the level of assumptions.
Exactly. Because there's a sutta, I think it's Majjhima Nikaya 11, where the Buddha talks about he says, whoever adheres to the view of being, which is kind of another way of very generally describing this attitude of accepting or indulging, they will argue with those who adhere to the view of non-being. Whoever adheres to the view of non-being, they will argue with those, or they will be against, even if they don't explicitly argue. They will have basically animosity towards those who are arguing the view of being. So for as long as you feel a need exactly to defend that view, it means there is an assumption of views there, which would not be present in somebody who has understood the nature of assumption, which is somebody who has found the middle way. So that's a criteria that doesn't matter how much it works for you, if you still kind of not that, obviously I'm not saying that you kind of abandon the recognition that some things are right and some things are wrong. That's not what it means. It means emotionally, if you feel a need to defend what you regard as the middle way, then that's not the middle way. Because it should be, like, it means you still doubt it. It means like the statements of another person are kind of internally shaking you to the point where you can't help but to try to justify why this thing is right.
Your whole sense of self, or let's say personality view, can be built up even more with your religious or spiritual practices, making a whole identity out of that. Somebody questioning those practices, and then you feel in the core of your being challenged in what you take yourself to be. That's a rather serious sign that you're having the whole thing backwards. Yeah,
because again, people might confuse supposedly not clinging to any views, which is another view, that you would be upset if, like, when you hold to the view that you shouldn't cling to any views, you see people clinging to their views, and you get upset with them, and you start telling them off. That's because you're clinging to your view right there.
Yeah.
So, but they failed to see, for example, all the Buddha spent time doing was saying, this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. And he was not clinging to his views at all. So people need to look for deeper criteria than just statements that you make, because clearly that was not the case. Like the Buddha did not manifest his non-clinging through making kind of open statements about maybe other people are right. I'm not the one. I'm not the only one. Quite the contrary.
Yeah, or for some people...
He even said, like, whoever does not see things in this way, I say that they are not a true renunciate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, he went that far. So that's not what clinging to views is.
Yeah. So there is the view... So there are the views that are right and that are wrong from the point of view of Dhamma, factually, that's one thing. And then how one, let's say, holds, quote unquote, that internally, that's another thing.
Yeah.
And so similarly, there is the observance of, let's say, precepts, and in a wider context, there is virtue, but how one is regarding that internally, that will be the factor that determines whether somebody falls into the assumption of or the view of sīlabbata-parāmāsa or not.
You could about the views, you could basically say, as opposed to thinking that the right view is another view that you take on, like I was following this other thing, now I just follow this one. It's more like the right view is the understanding of all views, because it's the overcoming of the assumption of views.
Mm-hmm.
So the right view is the view that understands the nature of views. That's why it makes you kind of incapable to cling to it, because it's not on the same level as all the other views.
Mm-hmm.
It's not operating on the same kind of, I choose to believe this as opposed to the other thing. It's like, I understand what it is that would make me believe in anything, and I see that as not mine, so to say. I see that as not worth holding on to. That's what the right view is. So if others try to criticize that, anything that others could be criticizing would be a specific view, not the understanding of views.
Yes.
Like, who can say that understanding views is bad? Nobody can say that. So whatever they talk about by necessity won't be the actual, when they're criticizing it, won't be the right view. So if you feel offended, that's because what is being targeted is not the right view, and you're getting offended on account of it. It means you're holding on to it.
To the wrong view.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, to any view, like holding to views is wrong in and of itself. The right view is not something that you can hold on to. That's the difference.
Yeah, that's a contradiction. Yeah.
Yeah. So the same with the virtue. Like it's not that when one overcomes attachment to virtue and practices, one stops being virtuous. It's more like, because the as the Buddha said, the actual practice of virtue is seeing the danger in the slightest fault. It's not on the level of specific precepts. You keep the specific precepts so as kind of guidelines. So there are certain things that can never be done without them being faults. But it shouldn't be like you should come to the point where you don't feel like being forced to not do something, being forced to give up one of your practices would feel like you're giving up the Dhamma. If it feels like that, then that's still something that you're holding on to. So the virtue, as we said in the last talk, the virtue in practices is made right, not by what you're externally doing, because that's kind of remains the same from Puttujana to Arahant. Just in the case of monks, keep the Patimokkha, keep the precepts for lay people, and so on. That doesn't change. It's internally the way you're relating to it. So that if you weren't able to keep any of this for X or Y reason, you would still
not do anything unwholesome on the level of intentions.
Exactly.
Or
So
at least
if you were to forget, let's say if you were to forget about everything you learned, you forget about the precepts, you don't know anything about the Dhamma.
Mm-hmm.
If there is real understanding, seeing the danger in the slightest fault, not engaging with unwholesome intentions by body and speech, that would remain.
Mm.
So that's another way of testing, like, am I holding on to virtue and duty, which means self-mortification implicitly, would be if I were to get, lose my memory completely, if I just get Alzheimer's or something,
Mm-hmm.
do I feel fear, any kind of trepidation that maybe this stuff that I've been developing will go, I'll lose it.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, then it's like losing those memories, basically. What else is it? Your practice is dependent on these memories, dependent on these things that could go away. Just you hit your head and you forget everything.
Yeah, that's just content, basically.
Yeah. So that exactly. So for as long as it's that case, for as long as it's like that, it's dependent on the content, and that's exactly what you don't want. As long as it's dependent on the content, it's not understanding.
Mm-hmm.
As we said before, if it's a particular view that you can hold on to, it can't be the understanding of all views. Because the understanding of all views is not a content; it's an understanding of content.
Yeah, that is more background or context rather than content.
Yeah. So so virtue should be a context.
A context, that's right.
That then dictates your actions, but not because you feel like you have to be doing these specific actions,
Mm-hmm.
but because the content in itself is the determinant.
Or the context.
The context in itself is the determinant.
That's right.
Of what's right and what is wrong.
Mm.
But like ordinary person starts the other way around.
Yes.
They try to do the particular stuff so as to reach the context, so as to reach the kind of wholesome and unwholesome, which is always on the level of the context.
Yeah.
So that's like inverting the order,
Mm-hmm.
seeing that it should be the other way around. So you can be doing the same specific actions, but if the context is wrong, then it doesn't matter how exactly to the letter it is according to the precepts or whatever. It is wrong because the context is wrong.
Yeah, and we have said earlier that intentions behind one's actions, this is what we're now referring to as context.
Yeah.
So
those intentions as well, that's also kind of where the middle way would be recognized, as we were saying before. If your practice is based on recognizing your intentions behind your actions and then abandoning certain intentions that you recognize are wrong, that should lead, if you're truly doing that, that should lead you, as opposed to just kind of taking something on and running with it, like, okay, this is it and I keep doing it.
Yeah.
If you're really doing that, questioning your intentions behind your actions, it would be impossible for you not to recognize the craving, the assumptions, the emotional dependence that is there on account of this meditation practice or whatever that you're doing. So, if your practice is not revealing you those things, is not revealing you why is it that you're doing this at all, how can you expect that it's going to reveal you what greed, aversion, and delusion actually are?
Yeah, so that has got to be the criteria. Yeah.
So this okay, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. You can't argue on the basis of the content, because people might read the suttas and say, well, no, this is exactly what I'm doing. The sutta says this.
Yeah.
So it is what kind of makes it at least closer to be right or wrong is this actually revealing you these underlying intentions that you have, that you would otherwise have been taking for granted?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of delving with the knife, as the Buddha said, as opposed to what people usually assume, that through a focusing practice, I'm delving closer into these sensations or something. Delving with the knife is in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
It's delving into these. So why am I doing this? What is the thing that's motivating this? So that's the kind of, if you want to hold on to a certain virtue and practice, like that's basically the closest thing that if you do it rightly, it will be taking you in the right direction.
Yeah.
At least. Because that's the other thing. You can't choose not to hold on to it as long as you don't have the right view.
That's right.
So you have to choose to hold on to the thing that's least likely to be wrong.
Yeah, until that disappears as well.
Yeah. So and during that endeavor, so to say, you have to be telling yourself, no matter how much sense it makes, that there has to be some way in which I am still either indulging the aggregates in the most general sense, or denying them, trying to get rid of them. Yeah. Because that's what kind of keeps you. It forces you to keep refining it. It forces you to keep looking further. Mm-hmm. That's how you're uncovering these intentions, because it's a constant process of refinement.
Which is basically let's say a thinking or pondering or considering right here and now based on one's concrete situation. So that cannot actually be mechanical or habitual in the sense that methods and techniques usually are like, regardless how I feel, basically regardless of this concrete situation, I'm going to do my practice, which is for me always the same. That is another way in which in which you can see that it is not going right. You want to precisely take into account this concrete situation, which is constituted by feeling, perception, mood, and all the rest of it. See what is going on there, and whether you're not either holding on to something which is pleasurable there, or wanting to change things on that level.
Yeah. So in order to see that, like again, everyone will start out, and it will be like a novelty. They will be able to see, oh wow, I'm seeing my intentions now. But if you don't remember that, if you were to already see your intentions truly or fully, you would already have the right view, because you would have seen what craving is. Mm-hmm. You can even take that as watching your intentions as your new virtue and duty that you cling to, in a way that you're not even trying to improve it. So to say, you're just assuming, okay, this is it, and I just keep doing it. So that's why in the end it doesn't depend on, we might talk about meditation techniques being, the obvious stuff like focusing, absorption, breath observation, or what have you. Mm-hmm. But that's not what makes it wrong in and of itself. Like let's put it this way, that is the very coarse type of wrong. But you can take anything. You can take, again, even this that we're talking about now, this practice of watching your intentions in that same wrong way.
Yeah, so somebody could say, I'm going to sit down, let's say, or pause for a moment what I'm doing, watch my intentions, but all of that could come out of reacting to some unpleasant feeling which happens to be there.
Yeah, and that is self-mortification in a way, because you are doing it because, again, and you're not questioning that. You're kind of focused on, okay, what am I going to do now? I'm going to question my intentions like this, blah, 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 blah. But behind that, okay, there's that feeling, and right then and there, you're trying to get rid of it. So that's kind of going against yourself.
Yes, but
it's self-mortification.
Yes, but now suppose somebody recognizes that, right? So they were affected by some unpleasant feeling. They've been following what we are talking about just now. They say, okay, I pause for a minute, I'm going to check my intentions. Then they recognize, there's just unpleasant feeling, and sort of I was just reacting to that by now taking on this particular approach. Yeah. So they include that. Then what? Is there anything more to be done than that? Or are we saying that that is precisely what needs to be recognized?
Well, if you did it fully, that's it. But you won't be able to do it once, and then that's it.
No, it is not like, oh, now I've seen that I was reacting to this unpleasant feeling, great, let's just carry on.
Well, that's what I said just now. Like, again, if you're taking the middle way as kind of a path that you walk once and boom, you arrive at the goal.
Yeah.
But no, watching your intentions is the Noble Eightfold Path that you walk always.
That's it, yeah.
So there's no end to it in the sense, like there is an end to it in the sense that when you fully develop it, there is no room for suffering to arise. But it's not like you kind of, okay, that's it. I can forget about my intentions now because I caught it.
Yeah.
It's more like, okay, you saw it now, but first and foremost, you see, well, precisely as the Buddha defined it, like an ordinary person is one who doesn't even recognize their own mind. So you can't assume that because you recognize it now, that at any moment something else might come up. So not like you start searching for stuff, but you certainly don't rest in that recognition. And then you kind of take it further. Okay, so look, I have spent who knows how many months practicing, and I was completely unaware of this. And it's been happening many times, and only now I recognized it. What tells me that there isn't 10 million other things like these, exactly in the same principle, that right now, just like back then, I was not aware of, and now, like, I'm acting out of them still. So once you recognize that, instead of going in the kind of natural tendency of, okay, I found it, you recognize, wait, no, this is just like scraping the surface. Yeah. So you would, and then there's like no end to that, so to say, or at least you shouldn't be anticipating an end to it, because recognizing your intentions in and of itself is how you become safe, like how you prevent yourself from doing things that are against your own benefit.
Yeah, one thing. So what you said earlier, like wanting to recognize an end is in a subtle sense still wanting to get rid of things.
Yeah, because if you want an end to this,
you don't want to do it.
Yeah. Like you're still hoping for a reward at the end.
Yeah.
And like obviously, yes, there is freedom from suffering, there is nibbana, there is all that, but that doesn't come on the level that you expect, that you can crave for.
Yeah.
Because whenever there is that kind of craving and expectation, that happens because of an underlying intention that you're ignoring.
Yes. So it's not going to be your freedom from suffering.
Yeah.
It's going to be freedom from suffering.
Yeah, exactly. So it is recognition of intentions to the necessary extent makes you unable to not see that those intentions are not for your benefit. And then once every single intention of that kind has been recognized, you can't act out of it even if you want to, because it would have been obvious from the start that this was not going to lead to any harm, to any good. It was only because you didn't see it that you were acting out of it. So that's why the Four Noble Truths go hand in hand. You can't see this as suffering without also seeing this is the origin of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, and this is the way leading to the cessation of suffering.